Okay, so on my spouse's instruction, this is only going to be 10 minutes. She normally gets her own way. Eileen and I used to come to these libertarian, we used to call it the Libertarian Spring Seminar, and in fact it was when the spring flowers last year bloomed that I was reminded, and I phoned or I emailed Frances, and she said it was in Wackerstrom, and I said, I've told you this already, we couldn't make it, but we've made it to this one, and it's a wonderful reconnection. And I could recall enjoying getting up and saying a few words back then when we had those seminars a couple of decades ago. And carelessly said to Gail in one of the emails that if she was trying to fill the program up, I'd be happy to squeeze something in for her. And then I thought I'd pulled out, but she didn't realize it. And so she sprung the surprise on me this morning when I saw the program. But in fact, I'd never intended to say more than the few words that I have about this idea by way of following the spirit of something that happened quite often at those early libertarian seminars, and that was a kind of a libertarian book fest where people used to come up with all sorts of books that they had. Sometimes they were for sale. But otherwise, just they were put on display for people to look at. And there was a wonderful assortment of literature in those days. And so perhaps in the spirit of a kind of a libertarian book club, I wanted to share with this audience, realizing that probably most of you haven't heard of this book, although some of you may know it very well. The title of the book is The Servile Mind. It has a subtitle, How Democracy Erodes the Moral Life. How I came across this book, and I'm not actually reading it at the moment, I read it a few years ago while we were in Australia. And so I wouldn't be able to give you as accurate an account of it or a review of it now as I could then. I, by way of introducing myself, have had most of my career in an academic life. And that job that I had in Australia was the last assignment that I had in an academic institution. And at the time, I was undergoing a profound introspection about my whole career as a university academic, because I began to see science even in the Australian university where I was working, and it was at that time voted one of the top 100 universities in the world. Awful signs of the educational decay that France described in our schools mainly in the earlier talk, but evident in the university in terms of kind of a fraudulent and dishonest system of examination, or at least of getting people through, and incentives to get staff to pass students in order to conform to expected sort of quotas of this, that, and the other. And misplaced criteria for determining merit and excellence within the system, and an increasingly bloated bureaucracy of effectively unproductive people in the organization running the place, but effectively parasitizing the place as well. I'm talking about the people in admin, and the admin staff just got bigger and bigger, and the lecturers were expected to do more and more work for them. And I suppose it's quite a good analogy of what many people are now referring to as a deep state, which everybody said would trip Trump up when he became elected president, and sure enough it has. And now he's effectively said something like, if you can't beat him, join him, and he's really part of the deep state now rather than fighting it. So universities had their deep state. This introspection of mine caused me to look around for ideas, because I'd heard of them once, about how universities used to be in the old days. and I came across this wonderful book called The Idea of a University, and it was written by Kenneth Minogue in 1975. And it's a brilliant book. You'd have thought it would be out of date by now, but in fact some of the things that he was talking about then are as relevant now about universities, and this is worldwide, as they were then, if not more so. The rise of postmodernism and the way that it's affecting university curricula and that sort of thing. And just the way people think, the way graduates think. Anyway, the idea of a university led to my then discovering that he'd actually written another book, because he had it published much later in 2010, which was just a year before I had come across it. The Servile Mind, How Democracy Erodes a Moral Life. And so all I'd wanted to do was to say, this is a great book, you must read it. I did actually bring it with me, because I'd planned to share it with anybody who's interested, and it's actually in the car at the moment, so I can bring it along tomorrow and put it on a table somewhere. If you just, please don't take it away, I'd like to take it home with me afterwards. But I'd especially meant to ask Leon. I'm sure he knows Kenneth Minogue, because Kenneth Minogue was a president, not very long before he died, of the Montpellieran Society, which many of you may know Leon is a member of. And he was very much in the mold of Hayek and others in the Montpellieran Society. And it struck me about this book, it's just another anecdote about it, that The Servile Mind was actually a play on probably a title that would have influenced and inspired Minogue, by Hilaire Belloc, The Servile State, which many of you may know of. And certainly this is a book of the same genre, which is worthy of the same kind of attention. So that's actually mainly what I'd wanted to tell you about, except to perhaps just give you something about the essence of the book. And to do this, it's best for me to read out, and I wrote it down, the concluding paragraph of a very good review on Amazon Books of this book, which goes as follows: as we allow the state, and this is really the conclusion of the book, or the essence of it, as we allow the state to determine our own moral order and inner convictions, the more we need to be told how to behave and what to do. I think I wrote here, but I've written some other stuff. In any event, it's about how increasingly we're allowing democracy as a system to undermine our own moral autonomy and effectively make moral decisions for us, and in the process control more and more things about our lives. And this is quite interesting, because it harps on a theme which is one that I also encountered quite recently, about democracy itself, which is the thing that everybody says, wow, we've got democracy, as being a wonderful thing. And then I was suddenly reminded when I heard an American politician comment, I think it was a Republican, with the recent appointment of the judge to the Supreme Court. He said something to the effect that the United States is not a democracy, it's a republic. And I thought, wow, why and in what sense do Americans consider their democracy to be different from just a winner takes all, or the tyranny of the majority type of democracy? Because what he was actually referring to is the fact that they have a constitution. And while the majority vote is considered to be important, there's always that caveat that there are certain immutable principles that cannot be infringed. which effectively restrain democratic government from going berserk. And I guess this idea fitted in quite well with what Rex referred to this morning in relation to Schumpeter and his idea that inevitably democracy would lead to socialism. And in fact, this is one of the abiding themes in Minogue's book, which I encountered, was he hops, and this is now very much later, obviously, because that was Second World War, and this is now 2010, and he's writing this book about how democracy will eventually lead increasingly to a more and more socialist, authoritarian type of regime. And it's actually democracy which is the evil thing, in its form, which is most frequently practiced in Western countries. And among these I include places like Australia and New Zealand. And Arlene and I had the mixed privilege of living in Australia for 5 years and experiencing the peace and enjoyment of Aussie life, and the enjoyment of making Aussie friends as well. And there's some damn fine people there. But also seeing the way in which democracy has crushed their spirit. They are the most supine people you can imagine. The way they are so law-abiding, but not just law-abiding, they think that they laud volunteerism as if doing something voluntarily for nothing is the height of achievement, the deserving of the highest accolades. And I found some aspects of Aussie social life sickening from that point of view. But in other respects, it was great to be there. In any event, the worry I have is that this erosion of the moral life is one that is increasingly making people more dismissive of property rights. In fact, of just basic honest dealings. And perhaps the best example of this, maybe some of the other points that I can just share with you as ones that are, I think, still big issues in a libertarian community like this, are what constitutes honesty, and honesty in a financial sense, which would be represented by, say, a gold standard, as opposed to fake or fiat currency, and the ability just for governments to borrow money, and if they can't borrow money from banks, then to just print money and chalk up debt that way, to debase currency. And it occurred to me that there could be a very important connection between the gold standard in financial dealings and honesty in people's social dealings. The old-timers would remember the day when a gentleman's agreement was very easily reached with a shake of a hand, and you didn't even have to have a contract. That was when we had a gold standard. That honesty in financial and social dealings must also imply an intellectual honesty. And here I just wanted to tell you about another book which has made a very big impression on me in the last 5 or 6 years. And that's by a professor of philosophy at the University of Ohio. His name is Neil Tennant. I happened to go to school with him here in South Africa, but he's been an expatriate since leaving school, I guess. And one of his many books published by Oxford University Press is called The Taming of the True. And I think for libertarians, this is a very special book. And if you go to chapter 12, he deals with the essence of cognitive significance. And I think what he's achieved in that book, in terms of how you can regain or reclaim intellectual honesty, with this concept of cognitive significance is just something very beautiful that I'd also like to share with you. So, having started talking about one book, it's led to another book, and before I go any further, and Eileen's now saying, you better sit down before you start talking about the other books, I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
So what's the libertarian counter to the servile mind?
That was one of the other things I was going to say, but Eileen said, no, your time's up. No, in fact, 2 decades ago, I gave a talk to this same group, and some of you, Francis and Leon and Trevor, would probably remember it. It was on Henry David Thoreau, civil disobedience. And he went to jail because he refused to pay taxes, because he didn't believe that the government that was taxing him was a moral government. And in his essay on civil disobedience, which incidentally was a great inspiration to such people as Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King, he described how liberating it was to be jailed for one's conscience. Some benefactor eventually came and bailed him out after he'd been in for a few months. But he sat there and thought about it, and he wrote a very beautiful essay about civil disobedience. And basically what he said was, if it just takes one man, he said, one honest man, I think he said, or something to that effect, to refuse to bend to the will of the state, it can have a bigger effect than anybody would ever expect. So at that time I thought, this is the way to go. But then to contrast that, I said, well, actually in one of her essays, Ayn Rand said, in a rather expedient sort of way actually, that there's no point in throwing yourself in front of the Juggernaut. In other words, if you simply refuse to bend to the state, they've got people there, there's nothing they'd like more than to bully you and to beat you up and to chuck you in jail, and so that you're forgotten about. And so sometimes that kind of heroic action is pointless. So it's a matter of individual choice and common sense, I guess. Rex.
You alluded to the American who, in your presence, emphasized the fact that America was a republic and not a democracy. And I think you posed a hypothetical question, what precisely, at least you asked yourself the question, what precisely is the difference? Well, unfortunately, that statement can no longer be taken to be true. But it certainly was the original intention of Thomas Jefferson and of the founding fathers. And they emphasized the fact that America was to be a democracy of free men. That was the expression that they used. And the way in which the freedom of the men, of the populace, was to be guaranteed was by way of the Constitution. But the purpose of the Constitution was to limit the form of government, the authority, the reach of that. And unfortunately, the Constitution has now been corrupted to such an extent that it, to all intents and purposes, doesn't even exist even in the eyes of the Supreme Court. The effect now is that America has turned from having been a republic of free persons to a democracy. And the essential difference can be illustrated by the reference to the fact that in a democracy, you have the danger, you always have the danger, of a tyranny of the majority. And in South Africa, we're experiencing that very keenly. The majority regards themselves as a result of the democratic process as being the representative of the people and therefore inviolate. And that was precisely what the American founding fathers were attempting to avoid.
Yes. The American I was referring to wasn't somebody in my presence. It was actually, it it was, I was watching television to do with the Kavanaugh nomination to the Supreme Court. And I can't remember whether he was an American politician or he might have even been that judge Napolitano, who was like he was a retired judge.
Resigned judge.
Oh, sorry. In fact, he might well also be a resigned judge. Anyway, he's the judge who sometimes now comments on Fox News and that sort of thing. But, and he was writing about this, and he was saying that one of the problems with Kavanaugh was that he was one of the architects of the Patriot Act, which is one of the major ways in which the Constitution continues to be eroded and undermined.
That should have been a disqualification.
Exactly. That's what he was arguing.
That should have been the issue for debate.
Exactly. And that's what he was saying. So it was more to say that, not that America is a republic, but he was saying it was intended to be a republic, like you say. Yeah. Martin.
I like the question that Gail posed. What does this mean for libertarianism? And I mean, you're talking about the breakdown of morality, as I understood it, or at least that was one of the themes that you were pursuing. And for libertarians, I would have thought that that is a good thing. That the notion that there is competition between the people who are moral and the people who are immoral in a society is one that we should encourage as libertarians in order to see and to try to make sure that morality succeeds, that morality in the marketplace succeeds. The problem, it seems to me, is that democracy is throwing up rewards for the immoral through the process of control and governance. And the question is, how pervasive is that? And the answer, I think, is really that it's becoming decreasingly rather than increasingly so. And I take two examples, and I'd like to put them before you. One is the protests that were generated against the Vietnam War, where one saw people, and it is a wonderful, if we can just sort of tout these things as you've done so beautifully. There's a wonderful series on Netflix by Burns, who did a gorgeous series also on the Civil War, on the Vietnam War, and I commend anybody who has Netflix to watch it, because what you see is the force. Somebody said powerfully that the Vietnam War was not lost on the fields of Vietnam, but lost on the streets in America. So that vox pop that was there, albeit self-interested, and that's of course what we countenance, was an immensely powerful force. But the next thing, and obviously the most important for me, is the internet. What that's doing to subvert the capacity of our rulers to control us seems to be immensely powerful. And then I take great heart from the embryonic Bitcoin system. I know I might be stupid. I'm hoping Rex will demonstrate tomorrow that I am. But it seems to me that Bitcoin is one of the ways that we liberate ourselves from the pressures that are exerted on us by fiat currency. Thoughts?
Yeah, I've flirted with the idea of Bitcoin, but I fortunately didn't burn my fingers. I read that Golden Economic Freedom essay by Alan Greenspan many years ago, which still holds true. He just never held true to it as a governor of the Fed in the long run. But it doesn't have to be gold. But as a chemist of sorts, I appreciate the very sound reasons why gold, rather than any other commodity, because of its chemical properties and its physical properties and its scarcity and its beauty, is the natural commodity of exchange. In other words, the natural basis of money, which is storing surplus capital accumulated through productive work, and then being able to exchange it conveniently in small denominations. and to have convenient either paper before we had electronic, or now electronic transactions using something, some or other form of cryptocurrency, is brilliant. And something like gold, and I can't think of anything that's better than gold, should back that in some way. And that way, you can generate a kind of an honesty which will become more pervasive than just in financial transactions. People will begin to become more honest in dealing with each other. Parents with their children, children with each other. It'll spread like I can't say a fungus, but it'll spread like a bloom of Namaqualand flowers. Leon.
Yes, the comments about democracy and sorry.
No, yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead, that one.
You know, when Van der Merwe jumped the queue and they said he must go to the back, he said, "I can't, there's already someone else there." There's quickly a comment about democracy. It's always bothered me that the term democracy can mean so-called democratic values or checks and balances. A Bill of Rights, for example, in the United States Constitution is considered democratic, or, as you say, some people would call it Republican. Well, we have one too. Does that mean we're a democracy or a republic? And we have original powers at second and third tier government. Does that mean we're in fact a federation? My guess is we are. I think that's what we are. We are in fact a federation. And we are in fact a republic. Because what you have in a Bill of Rights is that which is not votable. You may not vote it away, and in other aspects of the Constitution. Well, of course, you could amend the Constitution, as they can and have often done in America. But you mentioned cryptocurrency, and I thought it's worth pointing out that whether or not Bitcoin is the big thing it might be, and it still might be, what is potentially really earth-shattering and really very devastating to the power of government and a force for libertarianism is the blockchain, the system by which it works. And we are involved at the moment, and maybe Martin van Staden will talk about it when he talks about expropriation without compensation, but in case he doesn't, we are in the process, probably are we, the Free Market Foundation, of instituting in South Africa a blockchain method of title registration. And it looks, we've got some quite amazing parts to this, and FNB are willing to issue mortgages and regard a blockchain registration of a property that's not in the deeds office as worthy of issuing mortgage finance of adequate security. There are other aspects to it which are quite amazing. We even have, believe it or not, the EFF are willing to support us in creating blockchain title registrations in black areas that are not in the deeds office, like shanty towns and so on. So I think I'm always the Pollyanna who thinks alles sal regkom. And alles doesn't ever come recht, but alles also doesn't gaan verkeerd. We sort of muddle along, and I think generally in a world that's improving all over the show. Everything is, for almost everyone on planet Earth, is getting better. And I think freedom is getting better. And I think the internet and things like blockchain render increasingly the sort of thing Minogue talks about. And yes, I have been privileged to personally meet and know every luminary's name that's been mentioned so far here, that Mont Pelerin are very pessimistic people. But the reality is the other way around. Everything's been getting better for everyone everywhere. And internet and blockchain and so on are part of it, but much else is. Also, if I may say, although people vote, by and large they don't vote stupidly. And Switzerland is a sign of that. Switzerland really is possibly the only real democracy in the world, because absolutely everything is votable. It's not a republic. The public can vote everyone in and out of office, every law directly in and out at every level of government. And Switzerland has remained one of the freest economies on earth and one of the freest societies on earth by the vote of the masses.
Funnily enough, there's an irony there, if I can just interject there briefly, and that is that, as I understand it, Switzerland is quite a similar society to Australian society. And it's one in which, with that democracy gone, I wouldn't say gone mad, but with pervasive democracy at every level of, from local community through to national level, but especially at local level, there's a degree of suspicion and mistrust between fellow citizens. Typically, and I think Tibor Mackin, who probably spent most of his life in Switzerland, pointed this out once, that as peaceful and as prosperous as a country like Switzerland is, there can be a downside to letting democracy decide too many things, because you get people splitting on their neighbors because they chopped a branch off their tree or something like that, and so they don't talk to each other. But maybe that's just a downside of advanced civilization or something. Yes, Ivor.
I just want to, you mentioned burning your fingers with Bitcoin, and a lot of people saw it go up to $20,000 in December last year, and since then it's obviously pulled back a lot.
Yes.
6,400 is the current price, 6,424. It's still up year on year.
Oh yes.
By 12.7%.
And I'm still optimistic about it.
It has been up year on year for the entire year this year. Last 2 years, 922% up. Last 3 years, 2,272%. Last 5 years, 3,800% up.
Yeah.
Last 7 years, 250,000% up. So, you know, I had 2 Bitcoin which I sold at about $250 4 years ago. They're now worth $6,400 and something a pop.
Yeah.
So people who are negative about Bitcoin just because it was volatile and it went up and reached a peak.
They were negative because of its original volatility when it was only about $13 in 2010.
It's actually done that throughout its history. It's had these peaks,
yes.
these crazy peaks, and then pulled back by about 2/3. So yeah, if you want stability and you want certainty, then Bitcoin is not for you. But Bitcoin is still up and is still very much viable, certainly as a store of value. It's not really as a transactional currency. You've got other cryptocurrencies for that.
Yeah.
But as a store of value, there's nothing wrong with Bitcoin.
I go along with that. I share your optimism. Thanks. It's nice to have a confirmation. Sorry, Joe, and then.
For those people who believe that the internet is a possible resource for libertarianism into the future, I recommend bitnation.com. It's an entire libertarian jurisdiction on the internet, which includes its own currency, its own notary public, its own registration of title deeds, etc., etc. It's the creation of one woman, but it's now a really big operation, and it's worth having a look at. Particularly if the FMF is looking at doing title deed registration, that's all there and how to do it already.
Good. Okay, Colin with the last one.
I was delighted when I heard you use the name Kevin Minogue, because it reminded me, I haven't seen the book, but years and years ago I was the world's most avid reader of a magazine called Encounter, which was one of the consequences of the Cold War. It was an intellectual magazine in which Kenneth Minogue wrote in the late 1960s and 1970s, and it was terrific stuff to read. And I didn't know that he was libertarian inclined, just that he was a great writer all those years ago. It's often worried me, until recently, that libertarians seem to be so anti-democratic, and I haven't quite understood why, until I realized, and just sharing this with the group, that the only justification for democracy as a constitutional procedure comes from raising taxes. If you raise taxes, you're obliged then to have a kind of democratic system. But if you don't have taxes, there's no need for democracy. And when I realized that, I realized why it was right to be very suspicious and be hostile towards democracy as a means of justifying raising taxes. And so I've also reached that position where I'm also hostile to democracy, but I still regard it as a useful mechanism in decision making, and I can't see any better system. I don't subscribe to the view that I heard Rex mention of the tyranny of the majority, because it's better than any other. It's better than any other kind of tyranny, because at least it has the support of most people. So maybe that could be cause for comment around this room. And finally, if I could just ask the people if someone might help me, because I'm very naive in this regard, that if rights are derived from people, which I understand they are, and I've heard Leon criticize the term natural rights, and I understand that that's a contested term, but it seems to me that rights are derived from the people, and therefore, what is the purpose of the meaning of a constitution or a Bill of Rights if it expresses the will of the people in any case? I mean, I've heard you say that it limits government. Well, I mean, law courts can limit government without a Bill of Rights if it's based on the principle that people are the possessor of inalienable rights. And of course, we know that Britain doesn't have a constitution or a Bill of Rights, and one of the great downfalls of the EU is that it now has a Bill of Rights which is imposed upon Britain, which suggests that these rights are given by the EU to the people of Britain. I mean, what could be more absolutely revolting than that? Their rights are theirs in any case. So I've often it doesn't have to be answered now, but I've often wondered why and the Constitution, as Rex has said, in America is being interpreted out of existence in any case. So what is the value of a thing like that? And in South Africa, the Constitution can be changed by the majority, rightly so, in my view. So why do we revere constitutions and bills of rights? We don't have to answer that question now. It's something that troubles me.
Maybe if you allow me to respond briefly. You say rights are derived from the people, but but then you also mention inalienable rights. And if rights are inalienable, then they derive from some essence of
Something else.
No, of humanity, of rational beings who need rights. They have a right to life, but they need rights in order to survive as rational beings rather than just as animals. And if they need those rights, then you have to decide what is the fundamental right. It's the right to life, which is the source of property rights, because whatever you acquire through living is an extension of that property, or for the right to life. That's the one thing. The other is about democracy. You know, if democracy is that great, and then you can just change constitutions and you respect that. I don't. I see democratic elections, whether it's to change a constitution or whether it's to vote in a new gang of organized criminals for the next election. It's basically democratic elections are an advanced auction. This is how they've been described before, and I love it, the description. An advanced auction of stolen goods. That's all it is. And it's theft by the majority. And the more fine-tuned a democracy becomes, the more narrow the margin is between the victors and the losers, because they're actually arguing about dishing out similar goodies to the populace to try and push it beyond from 49% to 51%. And so you get these ridiculous elections where you've got about 0.1% difference between the winners and the losers. And they're basically the same gangs with this very similar agenda, but just a slightly different constituency that they're going to give goodies to.
Would you have a view on the Brexit vote then, which was a fairly fine line between the majority and the minority? What would your view be?
Well, I have a view on the Brexit vote, and that is that I think it just reflected the fact that the majority of British people who thought it was worth going out to vote thought that they'd rather try and get away from European regulation and having rights imposed on them and all that sort of thing than stay in. So And I'm all for that. And if Wales wants to secede and Cornwall wants to secede from the UK, you should let them do it.
But as a means of,
And
of discovering what the British population wanted to do, was that a legitimate way of finding out? I don't know, that's the open question.
It's a legitimate way of finding out, but whether the decision that whether the conclusion that they reach has any automatic legitimacy as a result of it being a majority, that's probably something to argue another time.
Okay.
So,
Thank you.
Over dinner.
Thank you.
Martin, thank you.
thank you very much.